Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be going over how to plan and structure your deloads for training. So there's a lot of different ideas that I'm going to be going over. I'm going to be going over some things which are a little bit more theoretical, but then also some things which are just a little bit more just the challenges that we're sort of faced with in coaching in real life. So hopefully this gives you some ideas, excuse me, for either your own coaching and working with athletes and how to structure their deload weeks and their training cycles. But it also can just, if you're reflecting on your own training, it can probably offer a bit of food for thought in terms of how you go about your training and some of the things that you can start to do to essentially manage rest and recovery and give yourself a nice runway of long-term progress within your training. Okay, so the reason obviously for why we would deload is because over the course of a training block you're going to be accumulating a lot of fatigue, and there is going to be at some stage where you need to rest and recover so that you can then actually you can realize that increase in fitness at some stage. Now, generally speaking, we utilize competition dates and certain things like that, which would dictate how long the cycle length is, and then also where to sort of put in those deload weeks. So as much as this is about, talking about deload weeks, pivot weeks, transition weeks, I'm going to be talking about the sort of differences. This is also going to give you an idea of how long to structure your training cycles. And there's obviously a number of things that go into that. So what I will do is I'm going to cover different scenarios, and you can sort of see here we have a bit of a calendar situation going on the side, so you can get an idea of how things look from a macro point of view. And I would say that when I started coaching, I would, especially with CrossFit, the CrossFit athletes that I worked with, I would create some elaborate 1 year plan, and there would be a lot of details within that. But quite often that ended up just, there would be changes made along the way. And then that plan, after about 6 months, I wouldn't be adhering to it as closely as I had started out with. So, back in the day, this spreadsheet would have been mapped out with a lot more details, but what I generally tend to stick to now is just looking at things more from like a week to week structure, sort of color coding them to give me a little bit of an idea of the intensity and the volume and how hard the training is just going to feel in that training week. So what I'm going to go over now is the real life scenarios. So this is just going to be probably what a lot of people are faced with in coaching their athletes, or people who are trying to pursue competition in some way, but they have work commitments, family commitments, and all those types of things. So generally speaking, life itself will dictate the length of a training cycle, and this for me personally happens quite often when I have athletes say, hey, I had, like, for example, just last week I had 2 athletes that went skiing. So we sort of started a new training block at the beginning of the new year, and then they've just had to take a little bit of a break between, maybe after 3 weeks of training, then they had to take a week off of training so they go skiing. Now, obviously, they're still doing physical stuff, but in that sense, what I would most likely do is I would just bring their, when they return, I just brought their training back to what they were doing the week previous. And I just said, hey, go into this and try to match your performances that you did a couple of weeks ago. So that's one scenario. Another scenario could be someone who has a work deadline, so end of the quarter or something like that, and they have a bunch of reports that they have to complete. In those situations, it might be that they're having to pull extra long shifts, or they're in a position where they're not able to train as much. So it could be that a work deadline gets in the way. It could be that they have a competition mapped out. It could be that, again, they get sick or they get injured. Now, one thing on that is, one thing to note is that if you have an athlete who is feeling quite run down, and then they start to have like these little injuries that crop up every now and then, if those start to accumulate, that usually does mean that they're overreaching, and it could be good to use a reactive deload in those situations. So this would be where you have to pay close attention to the athlete's training logs, your catch-ups, and those types of things. And if you're an athlete yourself, you need to start paying attention to these little things. And I would say that this is honestly the situation, or the way that training works for most people, is that they will go through life and life will bring up these sort of natural breaks in training. And in those situations, I think that it's fine to just count those weeks as a deload week. And the way that you would structure, training around these types of weeks is that you would probably have a bit more of a static approach to the training intensity, the training volume, and those things. And then maybe in these situations where you don't have any competitions, you don't have any work deadlines or things like that, you can then start to think, okay, I'm going to try to accumulate a good amount of training here. And in those situations, it's not necessarily that you're working until the wheels fall off. You could then, for example, start to use some of the other approaches, which I will cover in a little bit. But if you're an athlete, if you're someone who enjoys training and you're also managing a lot of other things going on in your life, sometimes that will just be the way it goes. And it's not an optimal way of training, but I don't necessarily think chasing optimal for those individuals is going to be the best approach. It's obviously things that we can constantly refine around their training and make sure that we're constantly improving and making the processes and the systems better through iteration. But we don't necessarily need to be forcing an optimal training progression or cycle length or anything like that. I would say just to the overall training process, it might create a bit of resistance, which we don't want to do. We want to make the training process, simple, effective, and also fun and engaging for them, because that's the thing that will keep them coming. So now I'm just going to cover the more traditional approach, and this is probably something which you're going to start to see more in textbooks. So traditionally, training goes through what we could call, there's many sort of different ways of phrasing and naming this type of stuff, but the way I'm going to do it is sort of periods of accumulation of work and then periods of intensification. So this could be, for example, in the accumulation, you are going through training, which is building volume, and then once you've sort of deloaded from that, you then go into a training block where the training volume is a bit more static. It can increase, and then what the focus is on is going to be on it being increasing the intensity of the work. And this is how a lot of the block periodization works. And this is, very, very often when people are, creating training programs for that are specific to the CrossFit Games season or something along those lines, you will generally see that people are using this approach. So blog programs, so if you sign up to one of these competitors programs, you're going to find that they will structure their training in such a way. And they sort of need to, because there is an element of they're not really taking in any responses and feedback, which is being directed back into the program. And because of that, they just need to sort of go with, what makes sense in the textbook, and it's the athlete's responsibility to sort of make good training decisions and things like that. The issue with this approach is that it doesn't work for everyone. And I think that if you have an athlete who actually needs to deload more often, or they can actually sustain consistent progressive training for longer, you're actually doing them a disservice, because for that person who needs to deload sooner, they might end up actually having just a real shitty week of training in the middle of a training cycle. If for the athlete who, for example, is able to actually train longer before they actually deload, in those situations, if you can keep progressing your training and applying a little bit more training stress per week, you want to continue that. You don't necessarily want to have to take a deload week halfway through just because it's in the program and it's what was written in the textbook. If you can keep progressing and you can keep moving forward, that's what you want. Think of it in respects of like a very basic linear strength program. let's say 3x5 on the back squat with a complete novice, a complete beginner, and every single week you're adding 2 to 5 kilos. And then if, say, for example, we're like, well, by week 4, we should deload because that's what the textbook says. But that athlete can actually just keep performing and keep progressing. Why stop them? And this is why, for example, deload weeks for CrossFit athletes for sort of gym members in a CrossFit gym, right? For general population, for those people who are training 2, 3, 4 times a week, deload weeks are useless because the training and life in general is going to create that sort of deload. They're not accumulating enough work to actually need it. Going off a little bit on a tangent, but for those individuals, they can just keep going and improving each week. And you want to try to allow that to happen. You don't want to force an easier week of training on them. So that's where the limitations lie within this sort of more traditional approach. But it is, if you don't have any feedback coming in from the athlete, then it can be useful and it can be just a safe bet. So the next method that I'm going to cover sort of comes from reactive training systems, and I believe that it is inspired a little bit by the work of I forget his first name, but there's a old Soviet throwing coach called Bondarchuk, and the idea is that you apply a static training stress. So you either repeat the same training session, or you repeat the same training week, which is going to be in this sort of respect. This is how I would use it and how I have used it in the past. And you would apply a consistent training stress until they're unable to keep improving on it. Now, there is going to be obviously some slight improvements week to week, just the sort of way that training will work. But in this situation, you do need to be you need to be paying attention a lot to the response of the athlete to their training and the training results. So the way you would go about this is you have your static training, so your repeated training exposure. So it's the same Monday as last Monday. It's the same Tuesday as last Tuesday. With CrossFit athletes, if I've used this in the past, I generally change up the conditioning a little bit by changing up movements and things like that, just to incorporate a little bit more practice for different things in the sport. But for example, strength training progressions, gymnastic strength training progressions, more conditioning focused like machine work and that type of stuff would be more of a consistent training. It would be more of a consistent training week. In this approach, you would run them through their training until they start to experience a performance drop. And then in that first week, if they experience a performance drop on sort of everything, you would most likely put them into a pivot week for the next week. But it usually doesn't happen like that. It will usually happen. So for example, it might be a performance drop on 3 of their main training progressions. And then in the following week, you might find there's a performance drop in 3 to 5 of their training progressions. In that situation, you know they have gone too far. So then what you would do is you would create a pivot week. And the pivot week, as laid out by reactive training systems, is not necessarily a deload week. So you're not doing the same things, but reducing the volume and intensity. You are going to be doing different things, and you are maintaining somewhat of a consistent training volume and training intensity. And for example, when I do this with CrossFit athletes, I will generally move them into a training week where maybe they're going through some variations on their strength work, where the variation itself is weight limiting, but the perceived intensity would be a similar intensity as what they were doing previously. Or it could be just creating a little bit more variance in the training style that they do, doing more accessory work rather than heavy barbell strength work, doing some more gymnastics play type stuff. So for the pivot week, that's how you would structure it. And then you would go back to your static training. Now, in this way, you would take into account, okay, last time we went through a training cycle, it was 4 weeks, and then we started to see that performance drop. So in this training cycle, you would go for 4 weeks again, and then you would create another pivot week. So you almost want to get ahead of them having that performance drop. And then what you could do is you could, on the next training cycle, you could just see if they could go an extra week. And then if they go an extra week and they actually keep, they're able to hit that sort of peak performance, we know that previously they started to drop in performance after 4 weeks. We know that then on this cycle, they actually were able to go for 5 weeks. So you could say for that athlete, their time to peak is, let's say, 4 to 5 weeks. And then in that approach, you know that the athlete is able to work 4 to 5 weeks consistently, and then they will be hitting their peak performance, and they will probably need to have a bit of a deload week or a pivot week, what have you. The thing that you need to do with this approach is you need to sort of plan it out within competitions, and you need to figure out a way of making those peak performances land on a competition week. So let's say, for example, we have a competition in week 30 and we've had a pivot week here, and the athlete's in good, they're ready to get into the next training block. What you might need to do is you might just need to extend that pivot block just a little bit longer, and I'll show you why. Because we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then on week 6 we have that competition. What we don't want to do is risk pushing the athlete to week 6, because we know that if around 4 to 5 weeks is when they hit their peak performance. So what we can do is we can just make this a 2-week pivot block, and then what we can do is we can plan the next training cycle so that they will finish week 5 on competition week. And then in that sense, you know that they are in peak performance. You know that they are going to be hitting their best performances after accumulating a good amount of work in the previous 4 weeks. And this approach works very well for static sports where, you are going to have, say, for example, in powerlifting, you might have this sort of build up and this ramp up, but you are working a good, consistent training stress. And then maybe before competition, you're doing a little bit more competition practice. I would say in weightlifting, this could work very well as well. And that usually is because in weightlifting, generally speaking, there's a day of training which is quite competition specific. So it might be a big Friday, it might be going heavy on Saturday on a certain variation or something like that. And because you have that consistent feedback of like where your strength is at, it makes it a little bit easier to sort of make to plan like this. When you have a lot of variables in a sport like CrossFit, it can be a bit more difficult. However, the body doesn't understand the difference between, say, doing a really hard 2K row and doing a very heavy back squat. It understands intensity, and the way that we adapt to, our strength work and our aerobic work and those type of things is generally going to be the same. It's not necessarily that you're responding to things differently, but the way that you do train these certain systems and these certain qualities can differ. So that's where it can be a little bit more complicated in a sport which is a lot more variable like CrossFit. This approach is very repetitive, and it works well for athletes who are able to stay on top of their training and are pretty good at making smart training choices of, whether to increase. They are able to follow RPE pretty well and that type of stuff. For an athlete who's still learning how to train, this doesn't work too well. In my experience, they sort of do need to have a little bit of the training structured in a way where they are learning how they will respond and adapt to training. Now, perfect scenarios that you're going to have athletes who will, from a beginner phase, they would just be able to dip into this and you would coach them through it. But I will say that in my experience, I work with a lot of, beginner to mid-tier level CrossFit competitors, and they have a lot of preconceived ideas around training, which are very much based on traditional approaches to training. And sometimes you just need to work with that a little bit, and then you can start to feed in some of these different approaches, which are a little bit more agile in nature. And then that's where you start to educate them about things and help them make better training decisions, which allow you to then have a little bit more, of a variable structure and less rigidity in how you plan training cycles. So time to peak is probably going to be, the most agile way of like figuring out how to how to structure a training block and incorporate things like pivots. Now, the other approach is something which I think is probably just as valuable, and it is a little bit similar to this time to peak, because what you are doing is you are just going to sort of test the athlete out, and through each training block you're just seeing where they're at and seeing if they can do a little bit more. So this approach would be a little bit more of like a linear progression. So week 1 you would start moderate, week 2 would be tough, week 3 would be heavy, and maybe on week 3 you're going for maxes and you're testing things out, and then you would have a transition week, which I'll go over in a second. And then for the next training block you would try a 4-to-1 structure. So maybe you have a week of have a couple of weeks of building, then it gets really tough, and then you're going for maxes or you're going for peak performances on that 4th week, and then you deload. And then the next one would be 5 weeks, and then you go into your deload or your transition. And then after that, if you say are accumulating about 6 weeks of solid training where you are just constantly ramping things up and pushing, then I would say something like a 2-week transition would be effective. And then over time, so in this situation, if we had an athlete who ran through all of this, you are able to see within about 6 months of sort of like what an athlete is able to work towards. And I generally have seen, I haven't seen many athletes be able to accumulate things for longer than 6 weeks. And usually they just get a bit bored afterwards, or, they completely undershot the beginning of their training cycle or something like that, which isn't necessarily going to be a fair representation of what they can actually go through. And I will say, just a side note, if you're athletes or if you are just getting bored with training, that is something to consider. So if that is the case, then you might need to, you can put in these transition weeks and change it up for the next cycle, because staying engaged and keeping yourself motivated and having a bit of fun with your training is very important, and it is a key part, especially for athletes who are not professional athletes. Now, in this situation, I've used the word transition week. So deload week is just everything is usually the same as what you were going through, but you're just doing it a little bit easier, less intensity, less volume. Pivot week is where we start to do things a little bit differently, and we would be doing things of a similar intensity, maybe a little bit of reduction in volume, but you would be you would have a little bit more of a consistent training intensity throughout. You're just doing things where you're not necessarily you're not going to be going through the same movements, you're not going to be going through the same training styles and things like that as you were doing before. Now, a transition week, what you could do is, rather than taking someone through 3 weeks of training and then taking them through an easier phase of training on their 4th week, on their transition week, what you could do is you could start them at week 0. So say, for example, we have in week 1 of the next training cycle, this is the plan. We want to be able to hit these percentages, these intensities, and we want to be able to go through this workout and elicit about, this type of response and this type of score. So in that situation, you might be able to go back a week, make everything a little bit easier, make everything a little bit lighter, and then just give them a good runway and a good platform to go into the next training cycle. So going for a week 0 or a transition week, whatever you want to call it, this can be very helpful because it gets an athlete aware of what they're about to go through. It gives them an idea of what maybe some of the new exercises are, some of the new training progressions and things like that. And it just makes it a little bit more of a seamless transition from cycle to cycle, rather than just sort of having everything very similar and then just going straight into the next block and getting your ass kicked in week 1. So I believe that this is quite an effective way of going about things. So anyway, that was a very long programming walkthrough of some different ideas around structuring your training cycles and your deload, transition, pivot weeks, whatever you want to call them. And hopefully some food for thought for the athletes out there of how long are you training before you take another easier week? If you're not taking easy weeks, then I would highly recommend that you start to implement that into your training. And then hopefully for the coaches out there, maybe some stuff that you can play around with and start to incorporate a little bit into your own programming. All right. If you have any questions or anything like that, drop them in the comments, and thank you for watching.